Chains of Empire, the untold story of Africa's slave kingdoms. What do you get when empire meets empire, and morality tries to wrestle with money? Picture this: African kings sipping palm wine while signing deals to sell their own people. British diplomats arriving with Bibles in one hand and treaties in the other, and somewhere in the middle, slaves being sacrificed to gods for rain, fertility, or royal favor. How did this tangled web of trade, tradition, and power unravel? Why did Britain, once a titan of the slave trade, suddenly decide to play the hero? And what happened when abolition met African royalty, who weren't quite ready to let go of their golden goose? From spiritual rituals to naval blockades, from sacred altars to secret negotiations, this is the story of how the slave trade in Africa was built, blessed, and eventually broken. Stay with us, because the truth is more twisted than the chains that bound millions. Ancient Egypt had slaves hauling limestone blocks while pharaohs posed for eternity. Carthage trafficked humans across the Mediterranean like they were olives. Axum's kings bragged about enslaving war captives like they were collecting trophies. In Africa? Africa had its own long, tangled history with slavery. The trans-Saharan slave trade lasted over 1,000 years, moving 10 million people into the Islamic world. The Indian Ocean slave trade shipped another 5 million souls to foreign lands, where male slaves were often castrated, yes, really, to prevent rebellion and ensure dependency. Slaves were laborers, concubines, soldiers, and status symbols. Slavery was domestic, military, and economic. It was everywhere. Then came the Europeans. Portugal docked on the West African coast in the 15th century, sniffing out gold and souls. They didn't invent slavery, but they scaled it like a Silicon Valley startup. Around 12 million Africans were forced across the Atlantic. Many died en route. Those who survived were condemned to generations of servitude. The trade was brutal, systematic, and global. But here's the twist. Africans weren't just victims. Some were collaborators, merchants, and kings who profited from the trade. Others resisted with everything they had. West Africa was no stranger to slavery. Long before the Atlantic trade began, empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai built wealth on slave labor. The Ghana Empire, 3rd–13th century, traded slaves across the Sahara. The Mali Empire, under Mansa Musa, extracted gold, salt, and copper using slave labor. Domestic slavery was common. Female slaves were imported from the Mediterranean to serve elite households. Slavery was woven into the fabric of society. It was normalized, monetized, and institutionalized. Once upon a time, not in Westeros, but in the sun-scorched savannas and lush forests of West Africa, powerful empires rose not with dragons, but with organized militaries and a whole lot of conquest. The Jolof Empire and Kabu Kingdom were the heirs to the mighty Mali Empire, which had recently collapsed like a badly built sandcastle. These successor states didn't just inherit land, they inherited a social blueprint: slavery as the backbone of wealth, status, and political power. Conquest was the name of the game. Neighboring tribes who couldn't defend themselves were swallowed whole. Slaves weren't just laborers, they were bling. Owning slaves was like driving a Bugatti in Lagos, flashy, excessive, and a clear sign you'd made it. Slaves worked the land, mined gold, served as soldiers, and, plot twist, some even became political advisors. Imagine being a slave and still having to sit through cabinet meetings. In some regions, slaves could own land, cultivate it in their spare time, and, if they played their cards right, buy their freedom. In other places, like Benin, things were far darker. There, slaves were sacrificed to mark royal anniversaries. Happy Death Day, Your Majesty. Here's a dozen humans. Now let's clear up a myth. When the Europeans arrived in the mid-15th century, they didn't find a bunch of clueless villagers wandering around like extras in a bad colonial movie. They found complex societies, slave-holding empires, and rulers who knew exactly what they wanted. The Portuguese kicked things off, initially shipping slaves to Europe. But by 1526, they had a new idea: send slaves to the American colonies. Sugarcane doesn't harvest itself, after all. And no, they didn't just storm the beaches and start dragging people into ships. That's Hollywood. In reality, most slaves were sold to Europeans by other Africans. The collapse of the Mali Empire had left a power vacuum. Splinter states were scrambling for dominance. Europeans brought firearms, which gave African rulers a deadly edge in their turf wars. Captives from these wars became currency. traded for guns, cloth, ceramics, and other shiny status symbols. Let's zoom in on one of the most fascinating figures of this era, King Afonso I of the Kingdom of Congo. In 1483, Portuguese explorers made contact with Congo. Afonso saw an opportunity. He had excess slaves from his expansionist campaigns and needed a market. The relationship was mutually beneficial, like a twisted version of LinkedIn for slavers. But Afonso wasn't just a puppet. In 1526, he pulled a power move. He forced Portugal to submit to his legal framework for slavery. This framework defined who could be enslaved and protected his subjects from being kidnapped by rogue raiders. Basically, he said, "You want slaves? Fine, but play by my rules." It was a rare moment of African agency in a world increasingly dominated by European greed. Once upon a time, in the glittering lands of the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, not Nigeria, though the confusion is understandable, the Ekan peoples were living large. Their gold mines sparkled like Beyoncé's jewelry box, and their appetite for slaves was as insatiable as a toddler's for sugar. By the 16th to 18th centuries, Akan states were booming. Slaves, mostly from non-Akan ethnic groups, were the workforce behind the gold. As many as 1/3 of the population were enslaved. That's not a typo. That's a society built on servitude. Forget Pan-African solidarity, ethnic divisions ran deep. The Akan weren't about to pass up a good deal just because the person being sold shared a continent. If anything, tribal rivalries made the slave trade easier. Unity? That was for motivational posters, not politics. Sure, there was resistance. Some coastal tribes tried to fight back, attacking European slave ships like mosquitoes against a battleship. These were small-scale raids, often by disconnected villages. They were brave, but tragically ineffective. Most of these groups ended up enslaved themselves. It was a cruel irony. The ones who resisted were often the most vulnerable. Meanwhile, larger kingdoms were busy signing trade deals and counting profits. Enter the Kingdom of Benin, not to be confused with the modern nation of Benin. This was a compact, powerful state in what is now southern Nigeria. Initially, Benin was a willing partner in the Atlantic slave trade, but by the mid-16th century, things got messy. The population was shrinking, especially the male workforce. Two rulers, Oba Esigi and Oba Orhagbua, said enough and closed the ports to European traders. Did they abolish slavery? Nope. Domestic slavery remained, and Benin would later fight Britain to preserve it. But they drew a line. No more Atlantic slave trading. It was a rare moment of African pushback, showing that not all kingdoms were cut from the same cloth. Now we meet the villainous rock star of this saga, Dahomey. Emerging around 1600 on the southern coast of modern-day Benin, Dahomey was like the mafia with a royal crown. Under King Agaja in the early 18th century, Dahomey went full beast mode. He conquered Alada and Waida, two slave-trading kingdoms with ports that processed tens of thousands of slaves. With control of these ports, Dahomey became one of the most formidable slaving powers in history. But wait, it gets darker. Dahomey's standing army was massive, up to 50,000 men. Military culture discouraged farming, so slaves did the agriculture. Idle armies are dangerous, so Dahomey kept them busy with constant slave raids. By the 19th century, 2/3 of Dahomey's population were enslaved. That's not a society with slavery. It's a slavery-based society. One scholar even quipped, "It's hard to tell if Dahomey was a slaving gang that became a state or a state that existed purely to enslave." Slavery wasn't just economic, it was spiritual. Dahomey's annual customs were like Coachella meets Game of Thrones. Military parades, political debates, and, brace yourself, mass human sacrifices. Slaves were decapitated to appease spirits. Some years saw up to 4,000 sacrificed in a single day. Funerals for kings also required slave sacrifices. Because apparently, nothing says rest in peace like a pile of corpses. Slaves were woven into every layer of society: labor, religion, status, and politics. Elites fought the king for control of the trade. Even the monarch couldn't fully rein them in. By the early 1800s, the British were on their anti-slavery crusade. They pressured King Gezo of Dahomey to stop the madness. In 1818, Gezo agreed to end slave sacrifices. By the 1840s, Britain wanted the slave trade abolished entirely. Gezo's response? Translation? Not happening, mate. Eventually, Britain forced a treaty to end slave exports from Dahomey's ports. But Dahomey subverted it by selling slaves overland to ports not covered by the treaty. Classic loophole maneuver. But the writing was on the wall. The slave trade was drying up. Dahomey's economy, military, and elite power structures were all built on slavery. Without it, the kingdom began to crumble. By the 1850s, Dahomey ditched Britain and cozied up to France, who were less preachy about abolition. But even that couldn't save them. The collapse of the slave trade meant no more wealth, no more status, and no more fuel for the military machine. Dahomey's political fabric unraveled. The kingdom that once sacrificed thousands to the gods was now sacrificed to history. By the late 1800s, the once mighty kingdom of Dahomey was running on fumes. Its economy, built on the brutal backbone of the slave trade, was collapsing faster than a sandcastle in a monsoon. European powers were turning against slavery. The Atlantic trade was drying up. Dahomey's main source of wealth, human trafficking, was no longer profitable. So what did Dahomey do? Desperate times call for desperate raiding. They doubled down. Dahomey began attacking neighboring towns, pillaging for captives like a kingdom possessed. In 1889, they made the fatal mistake of attacking a French allied town. France, ever the opportunist with a moral cape, declared war. You like slavery? We like artillery. France waged 2 wars against Dahomey, citing its penchant for slavery as a moral justification. In 1894, Dahomey was toppled. The kingdom that once sacrificed thousands to its gods was now sacrificed to European imperialism. Let's bust a myth. European colonization and slavery weren't always besties. Yes, in the early days, colonizers like Portugal used African territories, especially Angola, as slave factories. By the late 1700s, Portugal's obsession with male slaves had left Angola with a 2-to-1 ratio of women to men. That's not a demographic imbalance. That's a dystopian dating app. But here's the twist. Most European colonization in Africa happened after slavery was abolished. In fact, anti-slavery became a rallying cry for colonization. It was the moral fig leaf that covered a whole lot of imperial ambition. In 1851, the British Royal Navy rolled up to Lagos, Nigeria, like a colonial SWAT team. King Kosoko refused to end the slave trade. Britain responded with a furious naval bombardment. Lagos was forced to abolish the trade, free every slave, and expel all slave traders. The British later imposed abolition across all of Nigeria. But they weren't naive. They knew that domestic slavery was deeply embedded in Nigerian society. Move too fast, risk rebellion. Move too slow, risk hypocrisy. So they tiptoed, trying to balance abolition with stability. It was like trying to remove termites without collapsing the house. In 1897, a British merchant expedition was massacred near Benin City. Britain, never one to let a good excuse go to waste, launched a punitive strike. Slavery was once again a justifying cause. According to eyewitnesses, the Oba of Benin sacrificed hundreds of slaves in a last-ditch plea for divine protection. The British stormed the city, freed slaves, and offered emancipation and resettlement to any escapee. Benin's elites were slow to adapt. British authorities were still stamping out native slavery well into the 1920s. It was a long, messy process, like trying to clean oil with a feather duster. Let's not sugarcoat it. Millions of Africans suffered unspeakable cruelty across the Atlantic, the Sahara, the Indian Ocean, and within Africa itself. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Africans were not just victims. Some were abolitionists, especially the enslaved themselves. But many were traders, raiders, and rulers who profited from slavery. They built empires, funded armies, and cemented power through human bondage. Africa was not uniquely guilty. Nor was it uniquely innocent. It was part of a shared human story of exploitation, suffering, and eventual resistance. History isn't a courtroom. It's a mirror. And in that mirror, we see a continent full of people as complicated, ambitious, and flawed as any other. So let's tell it straight. Dahomey fell not just to French guns, but to its own dependence on slavery. Colonization came cloaked in abolitionist rhetoric, but often served imperial greed. African societies were active agents in their own histories, sometimes resisting, sometimes enabling, always navigating. This isn't a tale of good versus evil. It's a tale of power, survival, and the messy choices people make when caught between morality and ambition. Watch out for more fact-knowing videos. If this story has you hooked, trust me, we're just scratching the surface. Make sure to subscribe, like, and ring that notification bell like it's calling the ancestors. We've got more untold truths, epic histories, and jaw-dropping revelations coming your way. Don't just watch history. Be part of the tribe that uncovers it.